Okay, good morning everybody. Welcome to our weekly cybersecurity webinar. Wanted to first off start off by thanking you guys for participating. I seem to think that this is a very valuable resource for newcomers to the cybersecurity career field. I think Chris shares my ambition about that. I'm just wondering why we can't get more people in here. You know, is there something we could change other than the time? Is there something we could change that would increase our viewership and allow more people to participate and benefit from this? Just something to think about. Once we get large enough, then Chris has already mentioned a desire to split off to like a weekday evening as well. And we could happily do that, but you know, we need to have 8, 10, 12 people in here each week in order to even consider that sort of thing. And we could easily handle 20, 30, 40 people in these webinars without too much difficulty. So give some thought to that. We would love suggestions on what we can do, what the mentees can do, etc., to try and help make things a little bit better for those who may be interested in this, looking for cybersecurity careers. So the big news this week, I think you all saw it, the big news from, well, I saw it here on PC Mag. It says the LastPass employee could have prevented the hack with a software update. And they got a hold of the software and everything. It's called Plex Media Server is what this guy had on his computer, on his personal computer that he was using to access corporate network resources. And so what happened, I don't know if you guys read through it, but the individuals were able to get onto his system, not the corporate system, the AWS, Amazon Web Services, but his his personal system, and they planted a keylogger because of this Plex Media Server vulnerability. They planted a keylogger, so they were able to watch him go through an MFA authentication. He authenticated using multi-factor authentication to Amazon Web Services, where the LastPass stuff was held, which was totally correct. But the fact that he was, number one, using his personal device, and number two, that software on his device had not been patched, allowed somebody to get onto his system, do a keylogger, watch him make his transactions, and then from then on, they were able to duplicate his actions to Amazon Web Services, and they were there. Chris, did you see the duration of the time that they were able to infiltrate? I think I heard it was several months.
That's what I heard too.
Yeah. So this brings up, and that's why I wanted us to sort of talk about it, in your Security Plus study guide, if you have one, it talks about mobile device deployment, or we call it mobile device management. How do you handle mobile devices? And there are a couple different approaches. One of which is that there is complete insulation, and that's the one on the far right, COBO. There's complete insulation between what the corporation, company, organization, whatever you want to call it, owns and manages, and what the individuals own and manage. A corporate-owned business only is the COBO model. And what's the number one Well, the upside of it is you get to manage everything. You determine what works best. You certify it for use on your particular networks or wireless infrastructure, and then you roll it out to your users. What do you think would be some of the disadvantages of a COBO mobile device model? Any ideas? Corporate-owned, business only.
I'll pick an obvious one, Scotty. Let's say I'm an executive and I want a Macintosh, and that Macintosh is not on the certified list. You're going to have an angry executive.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that one makes sense too. Good morning, Ron. I'm going to give you some time, Ron, so we can talk about your upcoming interviews, whatever it is. But when we're talking about mobile device management here, imagine telling your CEO that he has to carry a device for business and his own personal device. And oh, by the way, they could be the same bloomin' model. Yeah. And now here he is, she, having to carry two devices because the business model doesn't allow for personal device usage. So that's called COBO. It's also, a COBO model is typically more expensive because you have to buy all the mobile devices and manage all the mobile devices. So we have an issue, in our organization. Some of our senior executives go overseas. So they're like a day before they leave, they're like, hey, I need international data on this. I need an international calling plan. Somebody has to set it all up to do international dialing and international data. So it takes a crew of people to manage the devices that you own and you manage on your network for your users. That's COBO. The great thing about COBO is you manage all of the security endpoints. So if something breaks, it's your fault, period. There's no case of like this, the employee of LastPass didn't update the Plex Media server software. So that's corporate owned, business only. That is the a typical model, but then people walk in the door like, your CEO, CFO, and say, hey, we already have phones. What, this is a phone and this is software that connects to the network. This is a phone. Why can't we put the same software on this to connect to the network? So you have to answer those questions. The one that Chris shared about this week a little bit was BYOD. BYOD is bring your own device. And that is the most helpful, I guess I would say, business model, because everybody can connect using whatever they want. The challenge with that obviously is you have to set up the network infrastructure so that it will accept connections from any type of mobile device, Androids and iOS, for example. It gets really expensive doing that. So number one, you don't have to pay for the devices, but number two, you have to set up all the infrastructure so these devices can securely connect. There's also, and they put this in the green column, they talk about cost sharing. I don't know if you've ever heard some of the claims about cost sharing. There are people who say, well, if I'm going to use my personal device to connect to corporate resources, the corporation owes me money for the part of the cost of my personal device. Cost sharing. In other words, if I'm going to use this for business, you're going to help me pay for it. And that's a concern as well. In our organization, it does say in there that if you are teleworking or using your personal devices, You will not call on your employer to share costs. If you have internet, you're using your internet. That's part of the agreement for you to be remote. If you don't like it, then don't go remote. That's literally how the conversation goes in all of the acceptable use policies. CYOD, that's another one. Choose your own device. What that basically means is the organization sets up a set of devices that you can buy that will work. In other words, they've tested certain ones and said these will work on our networks, and therefore they go out and they say these are what you should buy if you're going to use your own device. And the challenge, the downside of that one is, let's say you say you can connect using iOS devices, Apple devices, and your CEO says, well, I got an Android. I just got my new Galaxy S30 or whatever, make my T-Mobile work. Well, that's a problem. Here's something that a lot of people don't think about. A lot of people don't think about this. What happens if you have a personal device that you connect to your corporate or government or organizational network, wireless infrastructure, and you do certain things on it, and let's say you save emails to your device, and those emails are part of a criminal investigation, let's say. That means that your organization has to go to the investigating authorities and allow them to confiscate your personal device as part of a legal investigation. A lot of people don't think about that. Where is the data? And if it's a 100% remote solution, there should be no data on here if you're doing it right. But frequently, people end up with data on their personal devices that may be part of a criminal investigation or a legislative hold. If you remember, we talked about that in one of our previous webinars. A legislative hold means that everything related to this particular conversation must be retained and must not be changed or edited in any way. Well, what if that's your CEO's smartphone? You have to take it away, provide him another one, him or her, another one, and those sorts of things. So a lot of people don't think about that one, but it is real. It is quite possible, and if you don't do it, let's say the investigation authorities say, we want everybody's mobile phones that were involved with this particular person who may have sent texts back and forth to him. And we have his device, and it shows all the people he connected to. So we need the CEO, the CFO, the CISO, the CIO. We need all of their mobile devices because this person texted to them. Guess what? That's a law enforcement investigation. And you can't say, nah, you can't. You'll end up, wearing striped jumpsuits. So something to think about when we're talking about mobile device management. Okay, and the last one that I have up here is COPE, which is corporate-owned, personally enabled. And that is, I had to look that up because all of these acronyms. Corporate-owned, personally enabled means that the organization buys the phones, the mobile devices, and it may not be a phone, it could be a tablet. But the organization purchases them and allows you to do personal business on them, like, I don't know, watching Netflix or connecting to your bank or, those sorts of things. Corporate-owned, personally enabled. And that is an okay policy, But what you end up with is you say, this is no longer just for personal use. I'm sorry, it's no longer just for business use, but you can use it personally. And they talk about, let's see, employees expect the freedom to choose, upgrade, and share mobile devices, and restrictions are unwelcome. Well, you know, if I buy it for you, you get what I buy you. Sorry. Anyway, so how do you do this in your organization? And every organization has to do this evaluation and decision based on their business model. And a word that Chris uses a lot, it's either risk tolerance or risk appetite. You should know both of those, risk tolerance and risk appetite. Look them up in your study guides. Chris, did you have anything on these mobile models?
I'm glad you found the chart, Scotty, because I was just paraphrasing the ones in Facebook without looking them up and was at work while I'm doing that. So.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Hey, Ron, would you do me a favor and talk a little bit about what's coming up with you? And we will all listen in, because I think it's exciting.
Yeah, so this past week I finally began my serious attempt to apply for jobs in IT and other tech. So those of you who don't know, my tech background is more into software engineering, but still at the junior level. And then I kind of study IT and cyber on the side. So starting Sunday, I started applying for jobs in the Southern Maryland area. And our economy down here is really based off the Pax Serval Naval Air Station. And we have a lot of jobs that have to do with software engineering, cyber, IT. So I gave a very serious attempt Sunday through Thursday to send out applications all over the place down here. And I heard back from a few, kind of like administrative, like asking other questions. And I scored an interview for one that's coming up Thursday or Friday with a defense contractor. I'm holding out to hear back possibly from a local government in the next county over, Charles County, for a more cyber position. But the job interview that I have this coming Thursday or Friday is I think it's called systems analyst, but I think there's some cybersecurity involved in there. I'm not exactly sure what 100% I'll be doing, but what was really helpful to really get this interview was, so I was doing the resume on my own, kind of fixing and figuring out how to put forward the best application. And the timing was right. I saw the Facebook posting by Scotty. He said, feel free to reach out to Chris or him to fix up your resume. So luckily, I was at the right place at the right time, my laptop. And I reached out to Scotty via Facebook, and I asked him to look over my resume. And he completely changed it for the good, and began to send this new updated resume, and that's how I got in contact with this defense contractor. So, take advantage of Scotty and Chris. Fix your resume appropriate towards cyber positions, and hopefully you have luck.
Very cool. Very cool. And just so everybody knows, one thing that happened with Ron is he sent me his resume and said, what do you think? And when I was looking at his resume, I want us to consider something in particular. I'm not going to show your resume, Ron, but the important thing to remember is that if you are doing a bulletized resume, in other words, just very short bullets, it's very difficult to fully describe the things that are going to get you that cybersecurity job, cybersecurity analyst in this case, because much of your resume doesn't have cybersecurity in it. So my suggestion, based on what I saw on Ron had lots of nice short bullets, but the ones that he wanted obviously, to emphasize to the prospective hiring manager, needed to be bigger. Did you notice I did that, Ron? You know, number one, I moved it up to the top, and number two, I beefed it up so it became narrative sentences instead of, you know, short, you know, helped an old lady across the road, or just something like that. So in your resumes, I do recommend that you be narrative in how you are describing your work experience, because you don't have a lot of it. So make it, use as much space as you can to express what you have done. If you guys remember in my slideshow that I did recently for the cloud security class, cloud computing at University of Potomac, I showed you the slide deck and I said, here's what you can put in your resume that says what you have done with CS-Sensei. Well, that is to try and put that into a short bullet would have been impossible. So just try and remember that. You need to use, based on what I saw with Ron, you need to use narrative sentences instead of bullets. Any thoughts on that, Chris? Anybody?
I would agree. I would also add on that if you have no clue what to write, look at job advertisements and see how they're written, and you may get an idea of what they're looking for with what you can write, with the topics you can write about. Specifically, look at the duties of the role and look at the qualifications. I would also say if you don't fit 100% of the qualifications, don't count yourself out.
Right.
If you can write about, what's a good percentage, Sky, like 60, 80 in that area? If you got like 60, 80% of the qualifications, shoot your shot with a narrative, right?
I would say instead of thinking 60 or 80, think of in terms of the actual qualification statements. Have to have this, have to have this, have to have this. Consider being missing one or two of those.
One or two. Okay.
Yeah. And I think that's going to work out about the same as what Chris was saying. But let's say you don't have the educational requirement. Apply anyway. Let them be the bad guys until you know. Because, and I think I mentioned this a few times in the past, what occurs frequently is somebody is going to put up a job vacancy announcement that basically says, I want a superstar who has 1 million years of experience and I want to pay them minimum wage. Let's go. And nobody applies. or people apply who don't meet that minimum criteria. So what happens then is the prospective hiring manager and HR have a conversation and they say, how much of this is what you require or the position requires, and how much of this is what you are actually hoping for? And that's when the HR manager and the prospective hiring manager have to come to an agreement, and frequently they will drop those minimum requirements because they're getting too many of the wrong kind of applicants. They're not getting enough applicants to where they believe that they can conduct a reasonable series of interviews. And so they cancel the whole thing and reissue the vacancy announcement. So I'd say, you know, if you're still missing 2 bullets, go for it. Give it a try and let them tell you no. So this is, I put the, and I'm going to just copy this into our chat, but this was what I put into the slide deck for the cloud security class when I was talking to them. And I said, you know, imagine putting this on your resume. Wouldn't that help you if you're having trouble saying, you know, well, my last job, I worked at Walgreens, and then before that I worked at, you know, a 7-Eleven, and why not put that in there? And I mentioned this to Ron. It's in your resume, but also if you can possibly figure a way to work it into the interview, tell them that you're a white hat. I think that it's an intangible, and I mentioned this numerous times. It's not the tool that's going to get you your job. It's you, the person, that the prospective hiring manager believes and says, I think I can trust this person. Everything else can be trained. Everything can be trained. Okay? So you've got to say, I've got the right mental attitude to be a successful defender of your organization's networks, and I want to be part of it. What do you think, Chris? Make sense?
Yep, makes sense.
Okay, cool. Oh, for those various business models, I'll send you the link on that one so you can take a look at it, because it does say they reserve all rights. So, okay, it's their graphic, and I just shared it on screen. You know, so I want to give techtarget.com, you know, their due. It's their graphic. Let's see. I had a couple other things I wanted to discuss. We talked about the various mobile device management models. Oh, one other thing about LastPass, this whole debacle is not over. I don't know if you guys heard, but there is a discussion now about starting a class action lawsuit against LastPass. Imagine being in an organization and doing it so poorly that you get sued. That's what it sounds like they're trying to come up with. Somebody is putting together a lawsuit that says, we trusted you, and you had some slack engineer who didn't care about security in an area where they possessed the capability of your company to fail, and they did. That's your fault. You hired the wrong employee, and you know they're gonna go after where the money is. They're not going to go after the individual. That engineer, he may be named in the class action lawsuit. He or she, I think it was a he, may be named in the class action lawsuit, but he's not going to, you know, have anything of value that is going to be worth suing over. So the class action lawsuit is going to go against the corporate coffers of LastPass.
Hey, Scotty, not to be a fearmonger, but that name in the class action lawsuit is probably going to be poison for his resume if he wants to go looking for a future position in that area.
Yep. He may go back to, I don't know, teaching or something like that, where he's not actively engaged in the field. Yeah, it may be very difficult for that person to get another job. Or, if they get a job, to be trusted. You know, you've already lost LastPass millions of dollars worth of business, and now they're talking about a class action lawsuit. So, punitive damages, because LastPass did not have a remote policy that kept this guy from doing what he did. Yes, he was lazy. Yes, he didn't update his software. I think they mentioned it was something like 20 versions behind. I think that's what it was. They said, let me find it.
Wow.
75 versions ago. 75 versions. Plex is covering their tail on this one. I'll post the actual statement. So, yeah, Plex keeps their stuff up to date. However, you know, they may look into some sort of a requirement, because everyone can be named in this. The question is whether you can make it stick. If Plex knew that this was a critical software update, which, by the way, it was a CV. They did give it a CV name, CVE 2020-5741. May of 2020 it was announced. Plex should have figured out some way to where their software won't work until you get that patch applied. Perhaps.
You would also have to have an organization with a really good security / certification team who can identify such vulnerabilities and provide such programs where if you even try to install that old version, it's not going to work on the system. The executable won't even load. The antivirus will come in and say, oh, nope, don't do that. Or some defender will come in and go, oh, nope, can't do that. And either way, it just looks horrible for LastPass because none of those controls were in place in the end.
Right. Yep, very good. A lot of people may not think about this, but patching and vulnerability management here in our organization where Chris and I work, there's an entire team to do that. It's like 10 people. Their only goal in life is to make sure that everybody is patched in the organization. And what they do is they use software tools, enterprise software tools, that go out and they say, who has what version do they have, and they can pull that up and take a look at it and say, this version is not secure. So they will literally push patches from the enterprise down to that individual's computer without them even being involved. They're just pushing patches all day long to systems that are on the network.
That's true for computers, but it's not true for mobile devices.
Correct. That's the challenge. If, for example, in our organization, they have mandatory patching cycles, and if you have not put the patch on your system, the system will not connect to the network.
Yes.
You know, that's the way they do that. I remember, and I shared this with you guys, I remember there was a big discussion about this because some of the worst offenders were the people in the front office, you know, the secretary and deputy secretary and all those sorts of things, because they traveled around so much, they didn't care about, you know, I just want to use my phone or whatever. And they and their people were the worst for trying to patch their devices. So it got down to, do we draw the line and stop our boss from getting in because of security concerns? Mm-hmm. And it came down to, and I heard this, I wasn't in the meeting, but I heard it was described where the assistant secretary, the guy who was responsible for all of this, turned to the CISO and said, who do I have to call? In other words, it's important enough that this needs to get done, and if I need to call my boss and tell him to patch his mobile device, then that's what I'm going to do. So that was a very honest and sensible answer. He literally said, if I got to call somebody, tell me who.
I still feel like they don't enforce those VIPs enough, because
What do you mean?
I mean, the user compliance on updating mobile devices, you know, the policy is if you're not up to date on this operating system by this certain date, you get blocked from services. I mean, you can't get on the internet for the organization. You can't access the email. You can't access the Teams. All the stuff that is for intranet for the system, but they don't send out that notification to any VIPs, because I've been told that they don't get blocked. So there's supposed to be, you know, basically a group that checks on the VIPs and makes sure that they are compliant, but there's no notifications being sent to the VIPs saying you're going to be blocked if you don't update. And I don't think that they have that block in place because they're too very important.
Right. So then what becomes the way of doing it is you personally go to their office and update their device for them.
We would usually do that off hours, though, right, Scotty? Like,
what's that?
Do we usually do that off hours, or whenever we can find when they are off? Correct? Like when they're off from work.
I think they do it during business hours. They go into their office and say, you know, for example, you know, the Office of the Secretary has their own IT staff. You talk to those IT staff and say, this particular device is particularly behind. Can you get a hold of it and patch it? And the guy's like, yeah, sure. You know, walk down the hall and ask the executive assistant, you know, can you go in and get his device? I'll stand here and patch it and hand it back to you, or something like that. So yes, it becomes a concern, and it ends up taking more time and more resources, but ultimately, who's responsible? The CISO, and in our case, the Assistant Secretary. If everything blows up, the Secretary's not going to lose his job.
Roger, copy.
Yep. So, again, it's a case of what you can do and what your organization management will accept from you. Okay? So, who put this thing in there? Oh, Ron? Okay. Yeah. And we mentioned this a few times in the past. We may as well switch over to this President's cybersecurity policy, national cybersecurity. The important thing to remember is that it doesn't just affect federal or government networks or federal or government services. The government is, because they outsource so much of what they do, they don't, for example, they don't own some of their infrastructure. They farm it out to Amazon or Microsoft. M365 is now web-based. It's cloud-based. So Microsoft's responsible for it, even if it's on your organizational systems. So for the national policy, if you've read through it, I still haven't gotten all the way through it, but it talks a lot about public-private partnership. In other words, it says we've got to work together or it's not going to work. We can do everything we need to do on the government side, and there will still be vulnerabilities because of the fact that the federal government relies on you to provide this service. Excuse me. And I think you guys may have read, we talked about it a little bit, you may have read that DOD was considering requiring every software application to be certified bug-free by its owners, which and I don't think they've done it yet, but if that does occur, then that means if I'm selling a particular software product, I don't know, a CAD product, and I'm selling it to, or I'm, certain government officials are using it, and the CAD product develops a, or there's a vulnerability that's discovered in my product, I'm responsible to make sure that everybody gets their stuff updated. And oh, by the way, because I'm responsible, if there's a breach or an exfiltration or a corruption or data manipulation or something like that, that's also my fault. That's what the government's considering. So these days in America, you just can't say, well, we don't touch the federal government, so it doesn't matter to us.
Hey, Scotty, I have something I can't wrap my head around. When they say bug-free, how can you guarantee that, especially if there's a 0 day?
You can't. That means that you certify it is as bug-free as we can make it, has been scanned, et cetera, but there is an ongoing, in other words, as long as this organization is using my software product, any vulnerabilities that are discovered remain my responsibility.
Gotcha. So it's kind of like keeping a risk register on hand.
Yeah.
Of all the bugs that are, and what are the steps we're taking to mitigate those bugs or try to resolve those bugs. Okay.
Well, imagine selling software to somebody. Let's say it's in this case, a media server package, and it develops a vulnerability, or somebody finds a vulnerability, and we do see that those vulnerabilities turn up every day. Every day. So when it is discovered, how do you, being a software retailer, somebody who sells software, you manufacture the code and then put it out on your, it's a game or something like that, and the game has vulnerabilities. What they're trying to point out is your responsibility doesn't end at the point of sale. Your responsibility extends into anybody who uses or misuses your software package.
So it would be beyond the contractual obligation to tell the government about it would become a public thing where, hey, let's say I'm a software engineer, you're a senior software engineer for XYZ company, and I found a nasty 0 day that no one else has found yet, by definition. And I go to the boss of the company and say, hey, boss, I found 0 day. Instead of the boss stopping at the corner and saying, oh, we already sold it, this is on everybody else, we as a company now have to take responsibility and say, we found this 0 day. We have to figure out a way to publicize it. Oh, by the way, we have to be careful about publicizing it because the black hats will sit there and go, ooh, 0 day? Yes, let's hack. Let's go ahead and have fun.
Right.
It's now an extension of the responsibility to the company to say more or to report to their customers, hey, this is what's going on, versus, we sold it to you.
If you remember in the end user license agreements or the logon warning banners, frequently it says you use this at your own risk.
Mm-hmm.
That would no longer occur. That would no longer be the case. The risk remains with the service provider.
Gotcha.
They cannot relieve themselves of all the risk by doing this. I think for everybody on this call, it's important for you to understand business risk. It really is. If you look in your study guides, there's probably a lot of discussion about risk. And you have to understand that money, how do I say this? Risk and money are sort of tied together. A lot of people say, well, like they did with the nationwide network of electric charging stations. They found a vulnerability, a couple vulnerabilities in that software that they use, that network that they use, that could allow people to pull up and get their charging for free, or to lock up other chargers in the network. Well, that's a big deal, but the government has said roll it out on time. So what they're saying is roll it out. If it doesn't work, we'll worry about that later. So the government has set themselves up to accept the risk if somebody ends up filing a lawsuit against them, because the government understood that there was risk in this software and said, I don't care, roll it out anyway. So if you understand, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I can give another good example, Python,
sure.
Program Python.
Uh-huh.
Python is a development program. You can create some really great data science type of work. You can do charts. You can do data analytics of really great, powerful nature. But it's also a program where you can run some really nasty programs to affect the system. And that program language is in many debates of whether it can be used on an actual laptop versus a virtual machine. And that's where we're having really great debates about what's allowed, what's not allowed. And that's the type of stuff that you deal with every day, day to day, when you get into that entry-level field of vulnerability management is, hey, what's the risk of using Python on a laptop if it's just used for data science purposes? And oh, by the way, they're not supposed to have an administrative account. If they have an administrative account, there's big problems, and then we go from there. And but that's another great example.
So I wanted to just sort of show you, I'm looking at the index for this study guide, this 601 study guide for Security Plus. It starts here and it says risk, and it goes down, 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 down. Next page, down, 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 down. All of this is in relation to risk. I'm going to read some of these. Risk acceptance, risk analysis, risk appetite, risk assessment, risk avoidance, risk information section on vulnerability scan reports, risk management and privacy, analyzing risk, disaster recovery planning, exam essentials. That would be a good one. Managing risk, privacy, risk question or review question answers, risk management framework, RMF, risk mitigation, risk transference, risk calculating defined identification process for risk. All of those are in this study guide. So you should understand that the entire making things work within your organization, software you use, access, services, all of those things, there is always a consideration for what is the risk to do this. And somebody should have made a decision that says this can or cannot be safely used in our organization, for example.
If you want to go deeper into risk, I put a link on the risk management framework from NIST on our chat. And if one of the links is actually an introduction online course, if you want to go deeper into it beyond that.
Okay. I would suggest that you not get too deep on it because it'll make your head spin. But the important thing is you have to understand what risk is. And I'm just going to give you a very quick, how do you define risk? Risk uses two key factors to it. Does anybody, besides Chris, does anybody have an idea of what those two key factors are that you put together to determine your overall risk? Anybody?
Security and resources?
No. No, this is when you're trying to define risk, you define it based on, number one, how likely is it that this will happen? And number two, what will be the result if it does? How disastrous will it be? So you talk about probability and impact. And you put those two together, and for example, something could be really disastrous if it occurs, but the chances of it occurring are almost zero. Somebody has to break into this building, has to get into this particular room, has to hit this particular key combination on a system that they have to log into, that sort of thing. The impact could be very high, but the probability is zero or next to zero, so you don't even think about it at that point. It's a balance between probability and impact. What if the risk of this occurring is, the probability is really high, but the impact is really low? Oh, it's going to turn all of our O's on our corporate papers to zeros. Yeah, okay. That's not a big impact. Although the probability could be very high, the impact is very low. So you always have to balance those two, and the way they do it is, typically you put together what's called a risk, I call it a matrix, a risk matrix. You say, what's the probability, 1 to 5, what's the impact, 1 to 5, multiply those two together, and you'll get a number between 1 and 25 that allows you to arrange your risk according to its quantitative or qualitative analysis. Okay, so it's called a risk matrix, and we haven't done a risk matrix here for probably 2 years, Chris. Maybe it's time for us to do another one.
Yeah.
But that's how you do it. You look at the probability of this occurring and the impact of this occurring, but what that also means is you have to think about it. You can't just say, oh yeah, it's okay. This guy gave it to me, so it's bound to be safe. Well, no. When you take it in, you inherit some of that risk. So there's a lot to be said for it, and Chris uses a word that I think is very smart. It's called risk appetite. In other words, you have somebody higher than you that makes the decision. But what you do is you put all of that in front of them and say, here's the risk. What should we concentrate on first? And let somebody else decide based on the risk that you put together, which goes first, which goes second, which goes third. Because you're going to run out of funds or resources before you get through that entire list. So, get somebody else to make that decision. Typically, it's the CISO in coordination with the CEO and the CFO to say, business risk. What is the risk? For LastPass, they obviously did not consider the risk to be high enough that somebody in their trusted inner circle, these 4 engineers that were working for LastPass, was going to have software that allowed somebody to get into the LastPass AWS cloud services account, but they did. It was pretty genius what they did. If you can't attack AWS, attack the people that touch AWS. And oh, by the way, because they use multi-factor authentication, find a way that you can watch them doing this multi-factor authentication. Needs a keylogger. How do I get a keylogger? This guy has this software. Get into the infiltrate his system, put a keylogger on. You have bypassed all of those security controls. Smart way of doing it. Sort of like when you go to your customer's desk and they have their password on the bottom of their keyboard. That can bypass so many security features. They don't think about it. They're just like, oh, I keep forgetting my password. Well, let's put you together a nice, strong password that you can remember. None of this 8 to 12 characters junk. Let's use a pass phrase. Right, Ron? So that's the sort of thing that you need to try and help educate your customers on. And the last thing I wanted to cover was this NSA best practice. Did any of you guys take a look at that? You have a chance to look at it?
Good reading, good things to implement.
Yeah, it was. And it's very sensible. It makes a lot of sense. But the very first thing you should do, upgrade and update. Make sure patches are applied. If patches are available and people don't use them, then you may as well not have patches. I remember, Chris, this was right when I think you were starting with us. We had a number of people in a webinar. Ron, you were on it. You were on this call. And we were saying if you could do just one thing in your organization, just one thing, to make your organization more secure, what would you do? And we talked about, increased training or, require mandatory orientation or this sort of thing. And I remember my wife was literally walking past me at the time, and she leans in and she goes, patch everything. And she was absolutely right. This is what NSA says. Make sure that everything, all of your patches are applied. Somebody says, oh, I don't have time for that anymore. Take away their mobile device until they do. If you're responsible for it, there has to be a way to make sure that your organization is secure. And if there is a known vulnerability that has a known patch and somebody decides not to apply it, do they deserve to be on your network? Subjecting your CEO to possible jail time, that's why you have to talk about everything in reference to business risk and bottom line. The business risk is this is serious enough and likely enough, that's the other one, probability and impact, likely enough that we have to take special precautions to make sure that we aren't caught in it. If that includes going to the CEO's house and patching his laptop, then somebody's got to do it. So remember, business risk and bottom line drive the company. So you have to always put your IT security discussions in those same words so that your C-level folks, the ones who can break funds free, understand what you're talking about. Any other questions? Anything else to bring up before we finish? This was a good one today, folks. I really enjoyed this one. Keep your eyes out for the news. Find news articles or even a video that you see on YouTube or whatever. Bring it back to the group and say, what about this? And talk about it as if you were the individual providing the service. That is a big plus for anybody in this particular mentorship group. We always talk in terms of business risk, bottom line, lessons learned. Others don't do that. They go so far as to say, if you do this, this can happen. So don't do this. Yeah, but in the real world, you've got people doing it already. So how do you handle it? Okay, business risk, bottom line, and lessons learned. All right, thanks everybody. We're on our last few seconds, so thank you. Had fun.
Thank you. See you next week.
All right, Ron, we look forward to hearing how things go. Okay, man.